Hey guys, welcome back. This is lesson 9, and it is also the first lesson of the biology unit. So we've completed chemistry, or at least completed all of the chemistry that we're going to complete in grade 10. And now we're going to move into the biology unit. And this grade 10 biology unit links up pretty closely to the beginning of grade 11 biology. And the way that we've planned it out, we're going to hit all the main highlights, all the stuff that you need to know for grade 11 biology. So you don't need to worry about missing anything if you're planning on going into grade 11 bio. If you are looking for more information about the stuff that we're going to cover today, you can look in chapter 2.1 in your textbook. We've actually split this chapter 2.1 into 2 separate lessons. So this week we're going to sort of talk about the first half of chapter 2.1, which is the idea of cell theory. And then on Wednesday of this week, we're going to look at the second half, which is looking at cell organelles, which is something that you probably have a little bit of experience with. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, or whatever. Like that probably is maybe the only one that you know. But we're going to get into detail and look at the cell organelles, which should be a review from grade 8, but for some of you, it's going to be brand new stuff. So we're going to be looking at that on Wednesday. At the end of this lesson, you should know about the characteristics that all living things share. So we're going to start off our lesson by talking about that. What is a living thing, and what are the characteristics of a living thing? We're going to talk about the tenets of cell theory. So cell theory is sort of like the basis of biology. The idea of like what is a living thing made out of, and like how one would define that. And then the last component here is sort of the pathway for the unit that we're going to follow. So the different levels of organization that exist in living things. So we're going to talk about what the different levels are, and then we're going to talk about where we're going to start, and then where we're going to end the unit in terms of the levels of organization of living things. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about so far, no worries. So the key here is that you are able to do these things at the end of the lesson, not at the beginning. So I'm going to start off by getting you to think about what makes something alive. So what are the characteristics of a living thing? So even if you want, you could pause the video and think about what makes something alive. Can you form like a list in your mind? Maybe there is a living thing around you. Well, there's definitely living things around you, at least microbes, but maybe you've got a family member in the room, maybe you have a pet, maybe you've got a plant that is living somewhere in your home. What is the thing, or what are the things that make that thing alive? So if you want to pause now, just for a second, think about that. Take a second to think about what are the characteristics that make you know that that is a living thing. Okay, did you do it? All right. What we're going to do right now is go through a little list of those characteristics of living things. I think this is actually part of the grade 7 curriculum. So you may have done this already in grade 7. And so then in that case, this will just be a review for you. So studying living things is biology. That's what biology is. And this is our biology unit. So it's obviously a study of living things. We're going to look at different levels of organization in this unit. And we're going to start with this very small. There are, in general, 7 agreed upon traits of living things. So 7 characteristics that every single living thing exhibits. And if it doesn't exhibit all 7 of these, we generally don't consider it to be alive. So this is like the list, the big list of living things. So first of all, does it have some type of nutritional requirement? Does it gain energy from a different system? So in this case, nutritionally, it could take in sugar, or fat, or protein. So those are typical animal nutritional requirements. Or if you're a plant, does it take in water, carbon dioxide, and light? That would be the nutritional requirements for a plant, or at least for the energy component. And then there's also micronutrients as well that organisms need in small quantities, like iron and calcium and things like that. But does it require things in order for its survival, things from an outside system? Because that's number one. Does it have nutritional requirements? Two, does it have some type of metabolism? So I wrote respiration here. Not every organism has cellular respiration specifically. Like there are other systems that are used to derive energy, but cellular respiration is the most common. So cellular respiration is what we do, which is that we take sugar, which is C6H12O6, and we combine it together with oxygen. And the outcome of that is that we release some energy and create carbon dioxide and water. There's a chemical equation there straight out of our chemistry unit. Very handy. So that's respiration, cellular respiration. But there are other types of metabolism in organisms. So they could potentially have an anoxic metabolism, so a metabolism that does not require oxygen. And there are microbes that don't use oxygen for their metabolism, so they have some other way of cleaning energy from another molecule. Or maybe they live at the bottom of the ocean and then they use some kind of weird metal compound to gain their energy or whatever. But they have to have some form of metabolism, so some form of doing a chemical reaction to gain energy. So that's the second component. So we've got nutrition. They take in something for their nutritional requirements. They do a chemical reaction to gain energy. They move. So this doesn't have to be the fact that they go from one place to another. So if we say that they're mobile if they go from one place to another, but they can also be sessile. So sessile means that they don't physically go from one location to another like a plant. Plants are sessile, but they still have the ability to move. So over time, plants move. Their cells go to new places. Their roots grow, their branches grow. Sometimes leaves will face light. And the same thing is true even of microbes. So microbes are able to move around. Single-celled organisms are able to physically move their cell, not necessarily to a new location, although some of them can do that, but they could potentially squeeze themselves into a different position or change their configuration. So they have some type of movement. Okay, so that's the third component. Excretion just means you eliminate your waste products. So for animals, we're eliminating the food waste. So when we digest food, whatever is remaining, we excrete it. And then we also excrete the byproducts of respiration. So we remove the carbon dioxide from our body. So we have some type of excretion where we're removing the components that we don't need. All organisms exhibit some type of growth. If you're a single-celled organism, just one cell, maybe you have a nucleus. If you're a protist, or maybe you don't even have a nucleus, maybe you're a type of bacteria or something doesn't have a nucleus, you're going to grow into a larger organism. Or if you're a multicellular organism, you do a little bit of that cell growth, but more often your cell is actually going to split into two cells. So the growth actually comes from cell division, as opposed to just making your cells larger. So either way, growth is being exhibited by the organism. So every living thing has some form of that. Reproduction. Does your organism, the organism that you're discussing, have the ability to reproduce? Not necessarily on its own. Many organisms require a partner for reproduction. All sexually reproducing organisms require a partner, but is there some strategy for reproduction? If you're a living thing, you're going to have some way to produce versions of yourself. And lastly, do they exhibit some type of sensitivity? Sensitivity just means can they respond to stimuli, and that's very general. Basically, if you poke it, does it move? For very complex animals like humans, we have all different types of response to stimuli. We can respond to heat and to cold, and we have emotional responses and all kinds of complex responses. But even single-celled organisms have some type of response to stimuli. So maybe when they detect less moisture, they change their metabolism, or when they detect that there is more sugar in their surrounding environment, they're able to increase the amount of absorption of sugar, or something like that. So they have some way to respond to their external environment. So that'd be a response to stimuli. All of those things are required in order for something to be alive. So let me give you a great example of something that traditionally people think is alive, but it doesn't exhibit most of these. Okay, so and we're going to talk about this more in grade 11 biology if you're interested, but I'm going to use a virus as an example here. So virus. So the question here is it alive? All right, let's go through our list. Nutrition. Does it eat things? No, doesn't eat anything. It's just a protein capsule around a piece of DNA. That's basically all that a virus is, DNA or RNA. Okay. Does it respire? So, or does it have some kind of metabolism? Does it do a chemical reaction to process and create energy? Nope, not a thing. Does it move? Like, does it move locations, or does it move even just as a virus particle? Does it have the ability to change shape or configuration? Or nope, not a thing. Does it excrete waste? Nope, doesn't do that. Does it grow? Well, it's just a protein capsule with some DNA inside. So no, it doesn't grow. It doesn't actually change shape or really do anything. Does it reproduce? Not on its own. So a virus has to get into a living cell, a host cell, in order to replicate. And without that, it's just a particle. So no, it does not have the ability to reproduce on its own. And lastly, does it respond to stimuli? We'll call that sensitivity. So it's just a protein capsule with some DNA inside. If you poke it, change its conditions, does it do anything? Does it respond in any way? Nope. So viruses are very strange. So we give them a lot of the characteristics of living things in that we talk about them like they're living. The whole COVID thing is a great example. We talk about it like it's a living thing, but really it doesn't have any of the characteristics of living things. So it's by the biological traditional definition of life, we would say viruses are not alive. I mean, if you're a virologist, maybe you have a different sort of idea of living things. And in biology, you'll find there is more than one definition for life. But the traditional definition here, viruses don't meet that. So something to consider, something to think about. All right. Anyway, so the reason I start there is that, okay, well, a living thing requires all of these things. Historically, we knew this. We knew living things did these, but we had no idea what living things were made out of. It's kind of cool, really. If you think, like, if you go pre-1665, so in 1665, that was when the modern style of microscope was invented, a compound lens microscope. So you could see things that were impossible to see with the naked eye. Okay, before that time, before 1665, we really didn't have a lot of knowledge about chemistry and what matter was composed of. So we didn't know about composition of matter. You guys have talked about that in grade 9 and 10, the idea that it's made of protons, neutrons, and electrons, which create atoms. The atoms interact, and then they form compounds and things like that. We didn't know any of that stuff pre-1665. We just couldn't examine materials very closely. So if you wanted to know, like, for example, what you were made out of, the best you could do is just look. You could just look at the things with the naked eye, and you don't really get a lot from just looking at it with the naked eye. And so there was lots of theories in terms of like what were living things made out of. But honestly, like the 4 elements theory, the idea that like things were made out of earth, air, fire, and water, very common around this time. It seems so archaic and so like ridiculous that people would think that that's potentially what living things are made out of. But I mean, we didn't have very much to go on here, so not very much data. So the invention of the microscope was a huge boon to biology and the study of living things, because we were able to look down on the microscopic scale for the first time, and we were able to see that there are certain true things about all living things, every living thing that was examined. And Robert Hooke was the inventor of the telescope, or the microscope rather, made some of these observations which still hold true today. We've repeatedly confirmed them with lots of different types of observational evidence, that these are true things about all living things. So those true things about all living things that we discovered with the microscope, we call cell theory. So the tenets of cell theory, those are the things that we learned about cells, are important. They're sort of like the foundation of biology, the study of living things. And so you need to know the tenets of cell theory. This actually comes up in grade 11 biology as well. But there are three basic ones. We've added a couple other ones to cell theory, but basic cell theory only has 3 tenets. So these are the ones that you need to know. So first of all living things are made out of at least one, but often more than one cell. So anything that you can think of that exhibits all of these things, nutrition, respiration, movement, excretion, growth, reproduction, and sensitivity, pretty much anything, well, I shouldn't say pretty much, everything you can think of that exhibits all of those is made out of cells. We have never found an exception to that rule. All living things are made out of cells. So that's the first thing that we've noticed and have repeatedly confirmed. The second thing is that the cell is the simplest thing that does all of those processes. In other words, if you go smaller than the cell down to parts of a cell, which we're going to talk about in greater detail on Wednesday, those are the organelles, what makes up a cell, you're never going to find a cell part that does all of the things. So it's able to do all of these things mentioned above. So the cell is the smallest and simplest unit that can do all of those things. And the last part of cell theory is that cells come from previously existing cells. This sounds really obvious. Obviously, to get a cell, you have to have a previous cell that multiplies into 2 cells, and now you have a new cell that came from the old cell. It really seems obvious to me. But for a long time in biology, post 1665, for a while, we thought that these microorganisms were spontaneously generating, that you could, for example, have some waste from an animal or whatever, rotting vegetable, and these new organisms would just spontaneously appear. And then we did a number of experiments and figured out, that's not true. You have to have some pre-existing cells there in order to create the new cells that are appearing. In other words, they're not spontaneously born from non-living stuff. You got to have some previous cells there. And that's sort of like the basis of all food preservation now. If you put something in a can, the reason it lasts so long in a can is because you remove all of the living cells in the can. You boil the stuff or whatever you do. And then that way, if you seal it in the can and there's no cells in there, you're not going to get any degradation due to bacteria or whatever eating in the food, because the cells have to come from somewhere. So unless there's like a hole in the can or some way for the bacteria to get in, it generally keeps. So those 3 parts of cell theory have been repeatedly confirmed. The last part is really interesting, because if you really think about the last part here, that all cells come from previously existing cells, there has to be an exception to this, obviously, in biology. And next year, when you get into in grade 11 biology, when you get into evolution and you go back through the generations, on and on and on and on, billions of years, eventually, once you get back to the first life on Earth, the first cellular life, you do get to a point where you have to think, okay, well, at some point, a cell came from something that wasn't a cell. It had to. There had to be an evolutionary step there where something that wasn't a cell evolved into something that was a cell. And so that is, by its very nature, the third tenet here of cell theory has to have been untrue at some point. But the problem with that is the third tenet here is based on evidence. So all of the evidence that we have shows that cells come from pre-existing cells. We don't have any evidence for the original cell. Fossil evidence for cells is extremely difficult to come by, especially if something that old. And so we don't really have any evidence for like the first cells. There's a lot of guesswork going on back there. So this third tenet of cell theory here is a little shady, because it obviously can't be true forever. There was originally like some cell that came from something that wasn't a cell. More on that in grade 11 biology if you're interested. Anyway, so those are the 3 tenets of cell theory. You need to know those. I'm going to give you a few additional facts about cells. Some of these might blow your mind. Your body is made up of between 37 and 100 trillion cells. It's really hard to conceptualize how big that number is. It is a stupendously large number of cells. So your body is coordinating the actions of potentially 100 trillion cells. All of them require oxygen to do cellular respiration. They require nutrients. You have to have a system to remove their waste products. You have to keep them at the right temperature. You have to keep them at the right salt concentration. I mean, it's ludicrous to think that you have to maintain a population of 100 trillion cells, and you need to keep them all healthy and happy in order to stay alive. I mean, that's a complex process. So humans are very complex organisms. Any multicellular organism is a very complex organism. But anyway, I just think that that's bananas. That 100 trillion is just a ridiculous number. You'll also notice, by the way, that the range here is a huge range. Like the difference between 37 and 100 trillion is a massive difference, order of magnitude. So one of the reasons why the estimate is so loose, 37 and 100, well, first of all, humans can come in different sizes. So there's very large humans and very small ones. So obviously that makes a difference in terms of how many cells humans have. But it's also true that the sizes of the cells in the body vary very greatly. Red blood cells are teeny, 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 tiny cells, barely even visible under a light microscope. You can hardly even see them. At least the light microscopes we have at school. Whereas there are other cells like pancreatic cells or skin cells. Those things are huge. They're 10 times, 20, 30 times the size of a red blood cell. So when you get that much difference in the sizes of cells, and you need to calculate an average size basically to calculate this total number, that's when the math gets a little bit shady. So you can be off by maybe an order of magnitude there, and that's why you get a really big discrepancy for the high and low estimate there. So 37 is probably on the low side. 100 is probably pretty high. It's on the high side, I would assume. So I would guess that the truth is probably somewhere in between there. Anyway, it's still a ton. It's a lot of cells. Each cell is made out of smaller parts called organelles. You probably already know that. And then that we're going to talk about in more detail on Wednesday. There are two major kinds of cells. And again, this concept is really important as you get into the stuff for grade 11 biology for next year. But prokaryotes are organisms that they have ribosomes, which you're going to talk about on Wednesday. Those are the things that make proteins. But they don't have membrane-bound organelles. So membrane-bound organelles are stuff that have like an actual membrane around the outside. So for example, the crowd favorite organelle. Anyone? This is a mitochondria. So this is the powerhouse of the cell. So prokaryotes don't have those. So if you're a prokaryote, you don't have mitochondria. You don't have a nucleus because a nucleus has a membrane around the outside. You don't have a Golgi apparatus. You don't have endoplasmic reticulum. None of those things. So prokaryotes are fairly simple, and they comprise only single-celled organisms. So organisms that just have one single cell. And those types of organisms are called bacteria or archaea. Those are the two main divisions of prokaryotes. Those are the things that are living on your body. So if you think 100 trillion is a high number, you have 10 times that many prokaryotes living on your body. 10 times that number. So a huge, huge number of prokaryotes is currently living on your skin, in your mouth, in your large intestine. Don't think about it too much, but it's a huge, huge number. They're quite small. Prokaryotes are much smaller than the larger cells of your body. And they don't have membrane-bound organelles. So no nucleus. No nucleus is probably the most key feature there. Okay, the other type of cell is a eukaryotic cell. So a eukaryotic cell is probably the cell that you're familiar with. It's the one that has all the different organelles, mitochondria, nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus. And those types of cells are what make up animals. Obviously, you are a eukaryote, so your cells have those things. Plants have those things. Fungi have those things. And protists have those things. So they make up all the other different kingdoms of life. and they're more complex cells. They have more complex cell machinery, and they allow for these organisms to be multicellular, coordinate with each other, have complex cell signaling mechanisms and things like that. Okay, so they have membrane-bound organelles, like a nucleus. Okay, and they're more complex. So those are the two basic types of cells. In grade 10, we're really not going to talk about prokaryotes very much, about bacteria and archaea. Maybe just in passing, we might discuss them. But we get into that a little bit more in grade 11 biology if you're interested. But for grade 10, we're really going to stick to eukaryotes because, well, humans are pretty self-centered. And the curriculum really focuses mostly on animals. We're going to touch on plants just a touch. But we are mostly going to focus on animal stuff because it applies to you. So it's, for a lot of people, the most interesting thing. They're talking about stuff that applies to them. So we're going to focus on eukaryotes. Okay, the last thing I want to mention here about cells is that they're limited to how large they can grow. There is a limit to the maximum size of a cell because cells have to get all of their food and everything and all of their waste products across their cell membrane. So if you have a cell membrane, you're a cell like this, and imagine this is like a three-dimensional, oh, that's a terrible three-dimensional shape. Let's see if I can do better here. How do I draw a sphere? Boy, I feel like my high school art teacher is frowning at me right now. Is that more sphere-like? Okay. If you can imagine, you've got a spherical cell, okay? All of the food and stuff that you needs to get into that cell, and all of the waste has to get out. The bigger the cell is, the more stuff there is inside the cell. Okay, so like the goo inside is more the bigger it gets. And that's the stuff that is using food and making waste. So you have more and more stuff inside, the bigger the cell gets. Now you also get more membrane, which is the stuff around the outside of the cell. That would be like this would be the membrane. You have more of that when the cell gets bigger, but not as much more. The volume, the inner part, grows faster than the surface area, the part on the outside, okay? And that's just a product of the fact that spheres have a greater increase in surface area or a greater increase in volume than they do surface area when you increase their radius. If you're into math, you can look at the equations for each of these, and then if for the same radius, the volume is going to increase more than the surface area. Okay, I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but basically the bigger a cell gets, the harder it is to keep everything in the cell alive. So there is a maximum size, and once you get to the maximum size, the only way for the organism to get bigger at that point is to split that cell into two cells. Okay, so there is a maximum size, and you do need to produce new cells in general in order to grow. That is going to be, after we're done this discussion of cells, that's really where we're going to go next. So we're going to talk a little bit about how cell reproduction works, how you get new cells. So that's where we're headed next. I don't want to dive into it too much now, but the reason that you need new cells is because they can only get so big. Okay, last thing I want to mention. Let's talk about the basic organization of life. So far, all we've been talking about here has been just the cell. But obviously, that's not the highest level of organization. It's the lowest level of organization. It's the smallest piece. Okay, and if you're a bacteria or an archaea, that's as big as it gets. That's as complex as you get. You are just a cell. Maybe you're living in a group of cells, but you're each your own cell. You're not an organism with the other cells. You got your own cell. But there are obviously organisms that have more complex levels of organization. And we're going to proceed all the way through these levels of organization up to the most complex. And there's like a lesson or two at each of these steps. Okay, so today and on Wednesday, we're going to be talking about the cell, the lowest and simplest level of organization. It's the single unit building block of life. For example, a muscle cell. I'm going to draw examples for each of these. So A muscle cell is like a really long cell. Looks like this. And muscle cells are really cool because they actually have more than one nucleus inside them. So there's a bunch of nuclei in it. Okay, so that's one single muscle cell. But in multicellular organisms, often you have a number of cells that are going to come together and do a specific job. So animals have a cell or a tissue that is made out of muscle cells, and that's called muscle tissue. Okay? Tissues are groups of cells working together to accomplish a common purpose. In the case of muscle cells, their purpose is to contract. So you might have 1, 2, 3, 4, and if we do end up going back to school, we're going to actually take a look at some of these muscle cells in the lab under the microscope. But so here's a bunch of muscle cells. And they are all together here, and their purpose is to get shorter and to contract, pull tissues together, do what muscle tissue does. Okay, so that's a tissue. A tissue is a number of cells coming together for a common purpose. Now you can go up another level of organization and you can get a number of tissues coming together. And that forms something called an organ. So an organ is a number of tissues coming together. A good example of a tissue, and I'm going to keep following my same example, is the idea of a biceps muscle. So a biceps muscle is an organ. It's a bunch of muscle tissue. So that would be the stuff that's in the muscle belly of the muscle. It's like the center of the muscle. But muscle organs, like a biceps muscle, are not just contractile tissue. On the edge of the muscle, you also have other types of cells. You have some cells that are going to protect the surface of the muscle. So if you've ever touched a muscle without the skin on, which is maybe you have never done that, it might be a little odd if you had. But actually, I shouldn't say that. You may have touched it in the form of like a steak or something like that. Not on the cut piece, like not on the flat side of the steak, but on the other side, like on the edge of the steak. That would be like the uncut portion. You may have noticed that it's really smooth. And the reason that it's really smooth is it has a layer of cells on the outside that are actually protecting the muscle. And that layer is called epithelial tissue. And you're also going to get another type of tissue that is going to attach to the muscle. And that's going to be a long nerve. Okay. So there will be some nerve tissue that's coming into contact with the muscle, and that's what's going to tell the muscle when to contract and when to relax. So you'll notice that there's a number of different tissues here, but they're all coming together towards a common purpose. And that common purpose is to, create a functional muscle. Okay? So that would be considered an organ. And you can, I'm sure you know other examples of organs, like your eyes, for example, are an organ. And they have epithelial tissue on the front in the cornea to protect it. There is nerve tissue at the back. That's called your retina for detecting light, etc., etc. So all of your different organs have multiple tissues in them. Okay, so tissues come together to form organs. Those organs come together to form organ systems. So an organ system is a whole bunch of organs that are all contributing the same type of contribution to the total organism. So for example, and going back to our muscle example, you've got some biceps muscle and a triceps muscle, and then you've got a number of forearm muscles, and you've got some muscles running through your hands. Oh boy, my anatomy knowledge here is going to drag. Thenars are they called, I think, for bringing your fingers together and apart. Those are in your hand. Anyway, you've got some in your forearm that are used for clenching your hand and for extending your fingers. You've got muscles in your shoulder. You've got a ton of muscles in your back. You've got muscles in your neck. You've got facial muscles for moving your skin around. This is going to look ridiculous. You've got large muscles running across your chest that are used to bring your arms in. You've got abdominal muscles running all over the place. You've got these. You've got these. You've got intercostal muscles, which help you breathe. You've got muscles in your legs for. Okay, I'm gonna stop here. But anyway, the idea here is that you've got a whole system of muscles sort of running everywhere in your body, and it works together all for in order to move your bones around. Basically, that's its basic purpose. So that's your muscular system. See, that's an organ system. It's a whole bunch of organs coming together for a common purpose. Again, you've got other organ systems too. In fact, you have 11 as a human. You've got a system, of course I'm going to blank on these now. You've got a respiratory system for bringing oxygen in and removing carbon dioxide. You've got a circulatory system, which is your heart and your blood vessels for pumping blood and transporting stuff in your body. We're going to talk about some of these towards the end of the unit. But anyway, you've got 11 systems. So those are organ systems, and depending on the animal, obviously the systems can be different, but we're going to focus on humans. And lastly, if you bring a whole bunch of organ systems together, in the case of humans, 11, you get an organism. So an organism is the complete organism, all of their organ systems brought together. In our case, that would just be a human, or a Homo sapiens sapiens would be our species. And the basic idea here is that all of those different systems are going to work together to maintain all of the different conditions that support life for your cells. Those systems keep the right oxygen concentration, they keep the right sugar concentration, they keep the right temperature, they keep the pathogens from taking over. All of those things combined together, the organ systems do that. They work together to do that. So all those conditions in the body are are considered to be homeostasis. So homeostasis just means keeping all of the conditions the same inside of the body. You're keeping them static. So all of the systems are working together to maintain homeostasis, to keep all the conditions inside of your body static. So it seems like a lot of information. We started off discussing this idea of cells. All life is made out of them. And as we go through this unit, we're going to talk about each of these levels of complexity in a little bit more detail. Cells come together to form tissues, which we're going to get into sometime next week. Tissues come together to form organs. Organs come together to form organ systems, and organ systems come together to form a complex organism. In our case, it would just be a human, but it could be any organism that's multicellular. So oftentimes, eukaryotes will have all of these levels of complexity. So they'll have organ systems and organs, but not all. So some eukaryotic organisms are only single cellular, or they might have one single tissue, and those tissues don't form organs or organ systems. A good example of that would be like a sea sponge. So a sea sponge only has one tissue. So obviously they can't have organs or organ systems because everything is just one single tissue. So that exists as well. And then all of the prokaryotes are only single cells. So they don't have any complexity greater than the cell. All right, that was a lot of information. I'd like you guys for homework just to do one question, okay? I want you to consider question number 2 on page 32 in your textbook. And then once you've done that, and maybe had a quick look over the note, try the exit quiz. So this one doesn't have a lot of, hopefully this is fairly straightforward. I didn't want to give you too much stuff for this particular module. So I will see you guys again on Wednesday, and then you guys are going to, I don't think I'm going to do a video like this for Wednesdays. I think I'm just going to have you guys look over some information about cell organelles, especially because it'll be a review for a lot of you, but I'll give you lots of resources in case you're getting stuck. You're going to review all the different organelles that are found in animals and plants. Okay, hope everything's going well for you, and drop me a line if it's not.